My name is Kalila George Wilson, and I'm from the Tsleil-Waututh Nation. I said to you that my mother is Leah George Wilson. Her ancestral name is Sitsia Ama. We share the same ancestral name, Sitsia Ama and Sialia. And my father is Michael Wilson, and he's from Alabama. And I also said that my grandparents are Synthalia, Deanna, and the late Ernest Ignatius Slauholt.
So when you introduce yourself that way, does it give you, each time you do that, a sense of self?
Yeah. I was very fortunate to live with my grandparents the majority of my life, the first 6 years. So I was always taught, I thought it was normal to know everybody's ancestral names. I thought it was normal to be with your grandparents all the time. And I thought it was that everybody knew you're supposed to tell people who your parents are and your grandparents and where you're from. So it's always been something I do. I always tell people who my gran and my grandpa are, and my mom, of course. So it's always been normal to me, and it's how I've always been, so it makes me who I am to speak
Was it a
that
bit
way.
of a shock for you when you stepped outside of your community and realized people don't do that?
Yeah. But even sometimes in our community, like it wasn't all, on our reserve, all the families weren't like that. Our family is very strong that way, where my grandfather was raised by his grandmother also. So it wasn't always like that. My grandfather didn't go to residential school the whole time. He was only in for a year. So it was different from person to person and whatever age group you're in and what your specific family was like. And our family, we're a little bit more diverse. My gran is Chotmish, and we also come from Snuneymuxw and Warnishka. So the way that my gran's family is and how her mother is and her mother's mother, it all depends on where your line is from. So what I thought was just, not everybody comes from the same things that you come from. So even though we're all Tsleil-Waututh, you all have different lines. You all have grandparents who married different people and kind of started out that way of like how our Tsleil-Waututh people are. Like we were kind of wiped out with smallpox. So the creation of our people and how we survived really shows in how we are today in our different families. We still do things differently, but we're still, our foundation is the same.
You wouldn't have recognized all of that when you were younger. I mean, you're just growing up in it. But now when you think about it, think about how blessed you were to be in a family that so embraced and was proud of its culture. And how, and I guess the lesson from that we learn is, if it had such a powerful and positive effect on you in your life, how important is it that everybody gets to, hopefully in the future, enjoy that same kind of experience?
Yeah, that's kind of why I feel sometimes I think I'm a little bit intense with how I think our people should be, because that's our responsibility. That's who we are. We have ways of life that we've always been, and I want that for my nieces and nephews. I want all of our people to feel how I felt and how my grandparents felt and how my mom feels about who we are.
It pains you to say that. How come?
Yeah. Because it wasn't a choice for my grandparents. It was taken away. It's not natural. It wasn't how it was supposed to be. That's not how we've been. And I wish it wasn't like that for them, because it wasn't anything that they did. It wasn't anything that they deserved. It was just life, and that's how it was. And that makes me sad, because I couldn't imagine being taken away from my parents. I couldn't imagine not having my grandparents in my life all the time. And I'm really grateful that I have that, and not a lot of people do. And I wish that for a lot of people, because it's made me who I am. I love where I come from, I love my home, and I love my family. And that's because that's what they showed me. They fought really hard to keep that. And they didn't have to. A lot of people didn't, because the things that happened to them were so painful that they couldn't even be. Not everybody survived, not everybody got here, not everybody had a family. And some of their families, you know, they got passed down a lot of things that are not human. People shouldn't have to be in survival mode for generations and generations. That's not right. And it makes me sad that my grand didn't get to be with her mom every day. She didn't know when she was going to see her grandparents. She didn't know where she was going. You go from one world, all you know, and you get shipped away and you don't know when you're going home. And I never had to worry about that, because I knew that my home was with my grandparents. My home was with my parents. So that's why it makes me very emotional. Sorry.
Well, you say you're a little intense about it, saying that this is what everybody deserves, but this is what everybody deserves.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So don't be apologetic about this. Like, fight for it, strive for it, be that shining example. How fortunate you were to grow up in a family that felt proud about their culture, embraced it, and wound up sharing it with you.
Mm-hmm.
That leads us to your exploration of language. Tell us how you got started. What's the journey been like?
It's been, I didn't really know that it was going to be that way. I also thought it was normal that other kids had their grandpa pick them up from school and listen to language tapes. And me and my mom always played, it was kind of a game that I thought was normal. I thought everybody did it. She would always test me on who, like our family trees, that's her gift, and that I thought everybody played that. And it was really fun for me. I liked knowing where our names came from. So my mom would say, okay, well, what's Gumpa's ancestral name? And at the time, before he got his chieftainship name, was Siapmak. And I would say, oh, Siapmak. And then she'd say, okay, what's Granny's name? And I would say, Synthalia. And my mom would say, okay, what's my name? And I would say, oh, well, which one? And so I would say, Sitsiatma, Sialia. And then she would ask me where the names come from. And I would say, well, Sialia, she's the mom of Synthalia. And we would do those kind of things. And when my grandfather would pick me up from school, we would listen to, he also had powwow tapes too. So he would like picture a big blue van coming into your school to pick you up, and he's playing, like, you just hear drums. Then you get in the van, and you know, your grandpa has long silver braids, and he's got a headdress or an eagle feather on his dashboard. And you know, those were just like normal to me. Like, everybody knew that he was Indian. Everybody knew that, oh, there's drums coming, that's Kalila's ride. And then on the way home, you know, there'd be traffic, and we'd come down 3rd Street Hill. And it was interview tapes, so it would be, I think they're linguistic anthropologist kind of people. And so they would say, how do you say, hello, how are you? And they would say, oh, ichu-ai-o, ichu-ai-o. And they would repeat it over and over, and he would be asking and they were old timers, so most of them were Huamathkoyam and Cowichan, and so you would hear them, and I just really remember their accents were really, they sounded like my great grandma and my great grandpa, like the way that they speak, it sounded the same, and so I always like had a connection. Like I can still like hear the tapes, and I was like five or six until I got to high school, and we would still listen to it then. So I always remembered how to say hello, how are you, how to answer, like just different random names, like what you would call a dog, or little stories. And my mom had cue cards from her school, and so they had a story about Chichikan, the mink, and they also did a play, I think it was about frogs, and like the different names for the animals. So she would come home and she would have her cue cards, and I like to read and do cue cards and those kind of things. So it was fun for me and my mom to kind of do that. So my grandpa, he would play those tapes with me, and it was just kind of normal. I thought a lot of people did that. And then in high school, I played softball. I was very, very into sports, so I wasn't really academic. I didn't really like school, but I played sports, and then I had a softball scholarship, so I moved away to Alabama I did the summer semester, and then I came back home, and I started working in our Treaty Lines and Resources Department, and I was a referrals assistant, so I learned about the department that my mom helped create, and she was the first director of Treaty Lines and Resources, and we were doing interviews. We did an elders knowledge study, and I got to interview all of our elders, and that's the same thing that my mom did. So I got to interview my gran and all, my grandpa, my late Uncle Herb, that's my grandpa's younger brother. We had a lot more elders then. That was, like 10 years, no, it was 10 years ago now. And so I got more interested in learning the language because when we were starting the Elders Knowledge Study, I had to look at the old studies we had, and we had a traditional youth study, and that was 20 years, I guess 15 years before that was in the 90s, and that's what my mom was doing. So she got to interview her grandpa and her grandma and all the elders then. So to have a feel about what I was supposed to do and how I was supposed to, I had never interviewed anybody before, so I really didn't know what I was doing. And I had to ask them questions like, what were these place names, or what stories do you remember as a child, or what was your childhood like? And that's how I knew how different it was in each house, because I had heard and interviewed different elders in our community, so I knew that not everybody grew up the way that I grew up, and how different, and who had language and who didn't, and it was very, very scarce. And I wanted to learn. So we had a couple language classes of Hunkamitnam in 2012, 2013, and they were using a method called Where Are Your Keys? And you use American Sign Language to be able to be working your brain not in English, so it's in a different language. So you start using I call it your Chalmuch brain. So it's like more natural to use signs because it's not a spoken language. So you're using your body, and you're using your Indigenous brain. And so I just started with weekly classes, and then I got kind of intense, and I would look in dictionaries and the Musqueam Reference Grammar book, and it's straight linguistics. Like I had no there was all these acronyms that I didn't understand, and in Musqueam they created their orthography using IPA, Indigenous Phonetic, or International Phonetic, and so each letter has a sound, so nothing ever repeated. So my mom would show me what she learned in school, and then it became kind of, I wouldn't say an obsession, but it really gave me a purpose, and I really loved it, and I didn't want to stop.
So were you, before going to sleep or waking up in the morning, dreaming about language?
Yeah, actually, I do. I dream a lot, and I thought that was normal too. So that's how I started understanding more, is when I would listen to tapes. Again, I would find the old tapes, and I would listen to interviews, and I would Google different classes, like with Halkami'nam, Halkamalam, and Hunkamitnam. That's the Halkamalam language family. And as you come down the river, the languages change, but the base of the language is the same. The way that your sentence structure is and the way that you tell a story is the same, and that's how you could communicate through all of Hwalmach Tamach. And so it became my mission that I wanted to become more fluent. So I took classes on the island, I took classes in Chilliwack, and we created our own. So we had some people come help us from their system of where are your keys, and we kind of just started from scratch. So we created curriculum and games and lessons, and that's when I started working in our language department. We just had a language department then, so in 2013, 2014, and we would bring elders in from different communities. We only had one Hunkamitnam mother tongue speaker left, and her name was Josephine Good, and she was married into Snuneymuxw, but she was from Coquitlam. And Coquitlam, they're smaller than us. Like, we're pretty small, but they didn't, their numbers aren't that large. And so she married when I'm pretty sure she was 14 or 15. And so we would go interview her because she spoke Hunkamitnam first, but married into Halkami'nam speaking. And so we would ask her questions about what she remembered in Coquitlam and how it was different when she married into Snuneymuxw, and how the languages were similar and how they were different. And so when we would go over there, she would just speak Hunkamitnam straight, and she wouldn't translate right away. And for me, that was easier for me to understand than to hear, this is how you say, hello, how are you? This is how you talk to somebody. This is how, you know those kind of Hunitam school, Western education. It didn't really click for me. I couldn't understand concepts, and it kind of just felt like you were memorizing things, and I couldn't connect with that. So I did things on my own time, and I would go talk to elders, and they would just speak to me. My number one teacher, the late Stita Matalwat, Ruby Peter, she really took me under her wing, and she would just speak to me for hours, and she would never translate. And she told me that that was how I had to teach, and that's how our language was going to stay alive. You couldn't mix them and just directly translate, because it means so much more. There isn't enough words in the Hwalmach to explain our Hwalmach. There isn't ever going to be any Hunitam person who will ever understand what it means to be Hwalmach, what it means to walk our life, what it means to speak what we have. And so that's when I just started figuring out how I was going to teach, because I knew that there was people who could understand the way that I did. Because even in school, I couldn't understand. It didn't really click for me until we were talking about things that were close to my heart, and I knew that I could feel it. And so when she would sit me down, we would have 14-hour days, and I was the only person she would talk to in straight Halkamitnam, and she would make me write it down. And I couldn't translate it. I couldn't write English. It was just, you sit here, ni amot stoch I te I chwalala, huyene, awat kwalstoch, ama I huyene. And that means you don't speak, you just sit there and you listen. And so I would sit there, and she would talk about what it was like for her, how she grew up, and how you speak to people in the way that our language works. It's not, we can sit here and the way that we're talking right now isn't how I would talk to my mom, isn't how I would talk to my grandma, isn't how I would talk to anybody else in a ceremony. That's not how you talk. There's different reasons for everything we do. You don't just get up and speak and say whatever you want. Like in a ceremony, the language is I wouldn't say basic, but it's very straightforward, because when you're in a big house or wherever the ceremony is, there's always going to be different categories of people. You're not going to have everybody who comes from the same class, everybody who comes from the same people or the same family. So you can't speak specifically to them. You have to speak to the collective. You have to speak to everybody the same. So that language would be different, and you're going to have people who come from all over. And so our language families could understand. If you have visitors coming in from the island or coming from downriver or upriver, then you have your basic squeakquel of what everybody's going to understand, because we do the same things, our ceremonies are similar. And the way that you would have a conversation, the language changes and your tone changes. And the way that our about Halkamitnam and Hunkamitnam, they're a little bit different. And it's also about where you are geographically, like what the weather was like downriver by freshwater, and when you come around and it's saltwater, it's a little bit different. And if you grew up on the river and then you go to the saltwater, you can feel the difference. And I grew up by the saltwater, so that's all I know. And so when we would speak with people on the island, I could connect better because of that saltwater and because of that, that spirit of it. And you could understand how your languages change. And I would really pray about it, because I wanted to know. I wanted to understand. I didn't want to just be able to sit there and say, oh, I have a degree in my own language. I wanted to live it, because that's how I was raised. I was raised to walk my walk and talk my talk. And so I didn't want to work in a Hunitam world. I wanted the Hunitam to understand that we have two worlds and we can come together, but you have to respect the way that we do things. You have to respect that it's not always going to translate. And I only know that because that's how I was raised. And that's the way that the language is. And there really isn't enough words to even explain how our language changes. It's like a song. There's a rhythm that you speak and you can understand. When you tell a story, there's only certain connecting pieces that you use when you tell a story. And it's to connect that you're explaining something, but it's only for, certain people here. You wouldn't tell that story to a person. You could have a conversation about it. But if you don't understand the connecting pieces of that language, you're also not going to understand the spirit of the language either, because each part of our language has a spirit. It's alive. And even in the way that you speak, if you've never understood it and you just memorized it, you're not breaking down the words and understanding it. And that's why I didn't like to make it very Hunitam. You could still use cue cards, you can still use any method you want, but if you're not understanding the spirit of the language and why we do what we do, then it's hard for me to why do you do it? You have to have a purpose. Anybody can have their language and say a couple words here and there, but if you don't feel it, what are you showing your ancestors? Your ancestors, this is the breath that they had, this is all they knew. And if you're only speaking just to say that, oh, I can say chair or I can say table, that's not as meaningful because you're not breathing life into it. And that's been my language journey of trying to make sure that you feel comfortable and you feel heard, you feel safe learning your language. And whatever method works for you is going to work for you. But as long as that you have it in your heart and your mind that you want to learn because that's your right, that's your birthright, that's who you are, then it doesn't really matter which way you go, but you have to have that Shkwalawan about it. And Shkwalawan, like to be able to translate it and break it down, the word for qual is like your words and what you speak, and Iwan is the inside of your body, like right down the middle, like in your chest, like what's inside you. And the SH is to make it a person, like what you're doing. So Shkwalawan really means your feelings, but it's the inside voice. It's the words that are inside of you is your Shkwalawan. And so in English, you could just say, oh, that's your feelings. That's a whole explanation about one word. And that's each piece comes together and means something. And that's what I want people to understand. It's one thing to be able to say a few words here and there, but I want you to feel it. I want you to understand it, because that's what our ancestors survived for. That's what they passed down. That's what they instill in us. And it's in everything we do.
So where would you say you are on your journey of rescuing your language and making sure that it's available to your generation, the next generation, and the generation after that? Because you want to be able to consolidate that and grow it.
I started teaching in 2016. We tried many methods. We tried weekly classes and immersion camps, and I did an immersion, what's called Indigenous language proficiency certificate, and that was through SFU. And so I moved to Duncan and I learned Hulkameetnam that way. And so part of your certificate was you had to create your own resources. You had to make lessons, you had to make lesson plans, and you had to learn how to teach. But that's where I did kind of experimenting, figuring out what was working with people, and then like working in like daycares, elementary school, and then high school, and then having adult classes. It was really different, because it's one thing to teach in a school or in a community, but it also, you have to understand where people are in their home life. Because if you're teaching someone once a week, you're only teaching them, like you only have an hour. And I didn't feel like that was, I didn't think it was good enough, honestly, because you're putting so many hours into creating curriculum that was in a Hunita mindset. It didn't make sense to me. I didn't enjoy translating nursery rhymes that didn't mean anything to our people. You know, it didn't connect for me, and I didn't enjoy it. And I thought that we could better use our time and our resources by doing things that were Indigenous. So having our own, you know, lullabies and whatever our ancestors did then. And I went to New Zealand in 2017, and that's when I saw a full immersion school in Te Reo Māori. And they go from, they have, it's called a kohanga, and it's a language nest, so that it's from the time that the mother is pregnant, she's immersed in the culture and in the language. So she only speaks her language. And then when the baby's born, you have time with your baby, your immediate family, and then when they're old enough to start going to, the language nest is like a daycare. They're always learning from the beginning. So from the beginning of their life, they don't know anything other than their tongue. And so I got to see that, and I wanted that. I was like, that is so amazing. And they're about 20 years ahead of us. So they started their language revitalization in the 80s. Oh, I guess that's longer than that. Oh, yeah. In the 80s and the 90s. So they tested all these ways and what worked for them. And I really fell in love with that because it was so normal. You had kids from little childhood all the way through high school and in university. It was all in their language. It was all written down, and it wasn't just, you know, Western Khunitam like or Pakea like. It was them. They were seen. They created their own with their own, and so we just went on a cultural exchange. So we were only there for a little while, and then I made a promise to myself that I would go back, and I would work in the school, and so it took me a while to save up and go, but that's where my tattoo is from. And so I went back by myself, and I stayed for 3 months, and I worked in the school. Te Kurakau Papa Maori, Te Kotuku, their crest or their animal was the crane, and that's Smukwat in our language, and we have a lot in our inlet. So it really made me feel like I was at home. And when I was there, I met with a lot of elders and a lot of medicine people, and I really felt like I was at home, like I felt a very strong connection. And that's when they talked about like their origin stories were a lot similar to ours. And the way they were was a lot of the same ways that we are. And that's because we're all Pacific, we come from the Pacific Ocean also. And so there was a lot of saltwater people there, and you know, we bonded. And so my job was, I thought I was just going to watch and learn and just like kind of sit there and okay, take notes. And I got there on a Monday and we weren't allowed to speak English. And I was like, okay, like I knew how to say kia ora. Like I didn't know, I didn't know anything. So I got there the first day and I didn't really speak. I did my own. They have their own protocols, so when you come in, they stand up and speak and you have to answer. And I was nervous because I didn't know any Maori. And they told me, no, you say your own. And I was like, oh, okay. So I knew what our protocols were, and I just did what I knew. And so I got there and I said my welcome or my acknowledgement, and I was grateful to be there and where I come from, who my grandparents are, and who my people are. And I got to sit there, and then we go around the table and you talk about whatever you're going to do for the week. And I was just like, oh, I'm just here to watch and learn. And they said, no, you're here to teach. So I was like, oh, okay. And I had a little bit experience of, teaching in a class, and we had resources, but they weren't anything like, they had full books. And I was very overwhelmed and I was intimidated because I didn't think I knew that much. I didn't think that I was fluent enough, because these kids are running circles around me speaking their own language, and I got a binder full of, oh, this is what we did day to day, and this is how we teach them to know their colors and numbers and that. And they said, oh, well, don't worry, like you can teach our kids and our kids will teach you. So I taught them Halkamelam, Hunkameetnam, and Halkameetnam. And we created we called it Amshasamata Statlo, and that means the journey down the river. So we started with upriver, coming downriver, and over to the island. And also the Schotmish, I don't know that much Schotmish Snachum, but we do have Scottish ancestry too. So there were some things that were so common with each language that I connected it that way, and I showed them like how the journey down the river in the language changes, but the people still are of the same home. You're of the same people, and that's how they are. So they talk about your mountain, your water, your iwi, your family, and your people. So I connected that they talk about their mountain and their water, I'll talk about our mountains and our water and where we come from, so that they would understand and we could have a common translation, so I could understand how they teach, but they could also help me understand the things that I didn't know I knew in the language. So I was teaching kids who were 9 to 12, and that is a very challenging age group. And so you had to be very creative about how to keep their attention, and I learned very quickly that what we were doing here wasn't going to cut it. And you know, they really helped me, and they caught on so well because they already spoke more than one language. So the more languages you speak, you can understand others. So the more multilingual you are, you can catch on a lot faster. So I was teaching them 4 dialects, but they already had 2, 3 languages in their head. Some of their kids, they were Maori, Tongan, Samoan, anything, any kind of Polynesian. So they, you know, they knew more than one. So they were helping me, and we kind of created our own language because I only knew bits and pieces. They were like teaching me really basic things, and they're like, oh, come on, you got to catch on, because we couldn't speak English. So I would teach them little pieces, and they would teach me little pieces, and we kind of blended our language and called it Halka Maori, and they caught on so fast. So that's where I understood that I was more fluent than I thought, because being surrounded with more Indigenous people who think the way that all Indigenous people think, you're with like-minded people, so it opens different parts of your brain that you didn't know you had, because in English it doesn't exist. But just because it doesn't exist in English doesn't mean it doesn't exist, period. And so that's what made me understand more, and I wanted to figure it out. So I spent 3 months there. It wasn't very long. Like when you're in there and you're doing language 24/7, and you're moving and moving and moving, you're going to different ceremonies, you're doing different things, your time just goes by like that. And it was really hard for me to leave, because I felt like I just scratched the surface. Like, how am I going to go home and I see you all have a community? Like, it was a huge community effort. It wasn't just the teachers doing it. You had to do whatever you're doing at school, you had to do at home. So they had agreements with your parents. The school had agreements with your parents that you had a responsibility to be able to speak this much Maori in your home. You had to be able to speak. You had an interview process to get into the school, and if your language wasn't up to par, they would give you different resources to up your Maori, up your reo, your language, your tongue, to be able to be a part of this community. But they never neglected anybody. They never said, you're not good enough. They said, no, you just have some work to do, and this is how you can do that. And they would help you and show you, and that's how our people are here. That's the way that I was raised and taught. Like my grandparents always said, you know, even it didn't matter who you were, it didn't matter if you had a lot or you didn't have a lot, nobody ever went hungry. Everybody helped, everybody pitched in your community, and we lived together. And that's what I wanted for our people. So when I came home, it was a big culture shock, because I just went from being immersed all the time, and I came home to not many people understood me. And there wasn't anybody who spoke Hunkameetnam or Hulkameetnam the way that I was understanding. So I would reach out to other people, and I would have little classes. I would tutor people and create different resources. And so I started reaching out to people and asking how they wanted to learn, and if they wanted to learn the way that I was offering and understanding, that I would help them. So I tutor people, and we had community classes, but it's hard when you don't live that life together. You don't have ceremony all the time, and you don't, not everybody lives that same life. We live in a very big city, and you know, you don't have, like we barely have a forest anymore. So, you know, we go for walks and you talk about the trees and you teach that kind of way. So it's more than just coming in and saying, here's a language plan, here's a language class. I want to know if you want to live the life. I want to know if you want to understand the way that our ancestors lived and thrived since time out of mind. And if that's the way that you want to go, then I can help you that way.
So you have this model from New Zealand.
Mm-hmm.
It's your dream to create it here.
Yes.
What resources do you need? What support do you need to realize that?
Well, funding, of course, but also people. We don't have any Hunkaminam mother tongue speakers left, so the closest would be Halkaminam. And we already know, well, I was already taught how the changes of the languages go, and we're never going to get our original mother tongue back fully, but if people, you just put the call out, and if there's people who want to come, we need just a place, we need the people, we need the numbers, and, you know, just people who want to understand. And we need a place to do that, and it's really hard in the city. You know, there's not many places that you can go where you can have nature, you can have all these kind of things. Mostly you need the people who want to go the distance and are dedicated for that. And in this day and age, you know, you may not have the money to be able to pay somebody to do that. People have to work. So really, I mean, I would need a team and a place and people who want to, you know, sacrifice a little bit. You may not be able to live a glamorous life being able to do that, but you can live a life where you have more meaning and more understanding about yourself.
I have confidence that you're going to make that dream realized.
Thank you.
You know, I've got something on our fridge over there. Go confidently in the direction of your dreams. Because, as Margaret Atwood put, you know, all it takes is a small group of dedicated people, and you can change the world. I have faith that you're going to get there. And, you know, and so thankful that you went on this personal journey yourself to ensure that the language is preserved, and you're already sharing it with so many others, but your mother and grandmother as well. Isn't it neat that you're able to give back up the generational chain?
It is really cool. And it was really cool when I would come home and I would talk about it, and I would tell my grandparents, oh, I learned how to say this, and I would teach it back to them. And their elders at different institutions. Gran works at Vancouver Community College, and my late grandfather worked at Capilano University. And so he would go in there, well, they both would go, they had their own days and they would go and share. And sometimes they'd be like, oh, come in with us and can you give a little introduction or give a prayer or give anything. And so it was really cool to be able to teach my grandparents their own language that they didn't learn. And it would awaken things and they would remember things. Like my grandfather, he would start remembering the things that his grandmother taught him. And it would make more sense about why we did things the way we did. So I would discuss a lot of things with him, and he helped me understand why our language is the way it is. You know, you could come home and say, oh, I learned how to say tree, or I learned how to say a paddle. And that's what they did. They carved, and we lived that life, and we paddle all the time. And we come from a long line of canoe builders, and well, we live right on the inlet. And so you can really understand how our people were because of the resources that we had. A lot of roots come from, you know, the bottom of the inlet, or the things that grew in the inlet, the things that lived in the inlet, and the things that surrounded it. a lot of our language is based around nature and what you would use to make clothes, what you would, and the words in the roots, you could see where they come from. And that's, I would say, isn't that funny that you would say this? And then it would spark a memory where he'd be like, oh, my ta'a used to say this. And then I could understand, oh, well, that makes a lot, well, it seems pretty obvious. Like, it was so obvious to them, so they wouldn't ever translate things the way, like, even place names, they're not things that are just simple. Like, you could say, oh, this place means that, but really it has deeper meaning. And if you know how to break down the words, you can see that it may just be a name, but it also has so much, it has a story, it has a meaning. It's like, it's a lot deeper, but our old people didn't know how to explain that. So they would just get frustrated and just say, it is the way it is, you know, wathafit. This is the truth, this is what it is. But when I would come home and I would say, oh, this word means this, and it would come out, we would talk for a couple hours, and he would explain, oh, my gran used to tell me this, and she would teach me this down the beach. And I never asked her why. It just is the way it is. But when I would be teaching him, he would be teaching me back. And so it was really cool because he took care of me my whole life. My grandparents have been my other parents my whole life, and to be able to give them something that they didn't have and that was taken away from them, it was like coming full circle, and it made me want to try harder because they did so much for me.
How do I say thank you?
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
What, in your language, how would I say thank you?
Oh, to one person you say haichka.
Haichka.
It's not really thank you, it's we're done, our conversation is done. It's not in a rude way. If you're talking to other people, you would say haitzapka, and that means right now, right here, we're done, and in our way that we're thankful, needs tsiatala.
Oh, haichka.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're magnificent. All of you are magnificent.
Thank you.
Thanks. I didn't get a chance to tell you that my very first job was at the White Spot in West